Well, I'll tell you a funny story. I was working on finishing up the last unit, in which I'm about ready to do, chapters 11 and 12 from Gifford, and I spent however long, 15 or 20 minutes, I think, talking into the camera and explaining negotiator identity issues, and then realized that I'd never pressed the button to get the camera rolling, so I didn't even do the video. So I will now be doing the video that I just did that I didn't do. So anyway, hopefully over the course of these videos you've found that I've been able to give you a little bit of additional insight beyond just what you've gotten from Gifford. Uh, that's what I'm going to try to do right now. I'll talk about some of these issues with mostly cultural issues and then some other issues that we need to talk about that are unique, not unique, but within the American scene itself. Uh, two big issues. One is time, okay, and we're going to talk about that, and then the other is space. And so those are two big issues that we'll talk about when you're talking about cultural differences. Some cultures tend to be polychronic, and by that meaning the way they view time is a little different, and they kind of have a idea of time that's not quite as linear, perhaps, and I'm not sure that's completely accurate, but they're less focused on linear time, perhaps, maybe a better way to put it, than Americans. Very monochronic. We see time as tick, 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 right? I'm just about guaranteed that every one of you has some device similar to this, although probably much more updated than this one. And of course, you can see it has the time on it. In fact, more people now use that device called a cell phone to look at the time than wristwatches. And that's been years gone by since that's been true. All right, what do polychronic cultures, what are we talking about? What are some of the features of a so-called polychronic culture? Well, one, generally you're talking about, and these are general rules of thumb, so don't get excited and think I'm trying to pick on anybody. This is nothing like that. These are just general rules for you to consider as you're thinking about this, because it could be helpful and it may be needed. Generally speaking, Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, and Mexican cultures tend to have this polychronic view. What does that mean? Negotiations kind of are more flexible in terms of their starting and ending times. I know from listening to a pastor that I know of very well, he described going to Brazil on a number of occasions and explaining that church in Brazil for him would start at 11 o'clock. However, you'd show up at 11 and maybe there's a dozen people, maybe there's one, maybe there's nobody there at 11. And then people start to filter in and eventually you get started. And then you just kind of go until everybody's ready to stop. And so you may start at 11:45, and if you're an American, you end promptly at noon, of course, especially if you're like me and you're a Baptist. I mean, my goodness, any Southern Baptist, you end at noon. Everybody knows that. Uh, there was an old guy at the first church I attended as a teenager who there was a clock above. He sat in the back of this small country church. I mean, this little tiny church that sat about 30, 50 people maybe on a really good day. Above his head, his name was Pappy, above Pappy's head on the wall was a clock. And half the time you thought Pappy was sleeping during the sermon, but promptly at noon, his hand shot up to let the pastor know, time to quit. It's noon, it's time for lunch, and we finish at noon here at this little church. That's a typical American approach. The Brazilian approach is a little bit different. So polychronic cultures, they tend to have flexible meeting times. They take breaks whenever it seems appropriate rather than scheduling them. They tend to be comfortable with a high flow of information, a lot of stuff coming and going, a lot of overlapping talk, a lot of back and forth. And they don't really get too offended by lateness. It's kind of like, yeah, you get here when you get here, and we'll be here when you get here, and we'll do our thing, right? Monochronic cultures, not so much, right? You're talking about Japanese, Northern European, and American culture time is very important. So there tends to be this focus on a very linear notion. Prefer prompt beginnings and endings. We schedule things. If you've ever been to any kind of a seminar, right, what's the very first thing they hand you at these seminars of various kinds is a schedule. And it's a piece of paper, and in fact, oftentimes they'll actually go over the schedule, right, as if you can't read it. We're going to start, we have registration at 8:30 to 9. We start promptly at 9:05. And then at 10:40, we'll have a break for 10 minutes, and we'll start promptly at 10:50. We'll go from 10:50 to 12:15, at which time we'll have lunch from 12:15 to 1:30. At 1:30, we will start again promptly until 2:45, at which time we'll have another 10-minute break, and then we will begin promptly at 2:55 with our last session, which will go to 4:55, at which time we will finish. Dinner starts at 6. The speaker after dinner is at 7. He will speak for 35 minutes, and at 7:45 we will have dessert until whenever. Okay, and you know what I'm talking about if you've done any of those kind of things. So, negotiators from monochronic cultures tend to prefer prompt beginnings and endings, schedule things, deal with one agenda item at a time. There's 5 things we're going to talk about. We talk about A, B, C, D, and E, and we talk about them in that order. We don't take them out of order. Polychronic culture, again, you sort of have, well, we're talking about A, but then suddenly somebody thinks of something about item E, and you just talk about it. That's not how Americans work, generally. We rely on specific, detailed, and explicit communication for the most part. There's not a lot of overlapping talk. That's considered rude. There's not a high flow and a high volume of information coming in and out. It's pretty narrowed. I prefer to talk in sequence, that is, you talk, then I talk, then you talk, then I talk, rather than we both are talking at the same time. And we tend to view lateness as a sign of disrespect. So you have those differences. Well, if you're going to negotiate in any kind of international sense or across cultures, you need to know those things. You can say, well, it's not politically correct to talk about these things, but that's reality. And maybe the world's getting smaller, and so that's not so much anymore. But I think there's still a lot of value in this, and that you need to be aware of these things. It does matter. I gave you the example of the Brazilian church. There's obviously differences there. What about space orientation? Certain cultures, Mediterranean, Arab, Latin American, tend to be more touchy, more tactile. I don't know where I get it from, because I'm a very touchy person, although usually not in business orientation, mostly just in personal matters. I tend to like to, if I'm talking with someone, to touch their shoulder, that sort of thing. I would not do that in a business setting, though, I must say. Apparently, among certain cultures, that's okay. Again, you need to know that going in so that you don't get offended when somebody invades your space. Americans are famous. We want our space. We like our space. We need our space, right? And you got a little barrier around you. It's about 1.5 feet or 2 feet around you, right? Every which way. It's a sort of a cone of, non-invasive area where people just aren't allowed to, point their finger in through it. We just don't like that as Americans. That's not true of other cultures. Asian, Indigenous American, Canadian, U.S. cultures tend to discourage touching outside of intimate situations. It just tends to be the case. Northern European, very similar. Okay. Space also relates to comfort with eye contact. As you may know, for instance, in Oriental culture, you tend to look down, and you often will see, the sort of the bowing as a sign of respect, and you sort of tend to look down as a sign of respect. In American culture, right, someone look us in the eye, right? Look me in the eye and tell me that, son, right? That's the kind of attitude we have. If somebody can't look us in the eye, we think they're lying, and we don't like it. Again, these are generalizations, and these are rules of thumb, and as with all rules of thumb, you have to be very careful in applying them mechanically. These are just general things to consider if you're negotiating across cultures. Doesn't mean they're always going to be correct. Doesn't mean every single person who's of Japanese descent will feel the way they feel. Doesn't mean that every Asian negotiator is going to want you to bow or anything like that. But nonetheless, these are things to consider and think about, and sort of keep in mind in case you get frustrated particularly the time issues. Those can be very frustrating, especially for Americans. Some couple just This is a chart I picked up years ago that I think is again, it can be helpful. It's just some ideas of things that you might think about. These are key indicators of success as perceived by various types of negotiators culturally. American negotiators, what do they tend to see as key indicators of success? Preparation, planning, and skill. Thinking under pressure, judgment and intelligence, verbal expressiveness, product knowledge. These are all very highly valued by American negotiators. What about Japanese negotiators? Well, dedication to job is a very high priority. Perceive and exploit power. That shouldn't surprise you if you know something about the Oriental mindset, and particularly Japanese. Win respect and confidence. Okay, very, very important. This saving face is a big deal in Oriental culture, right? Integrity, very important. What about Taiwanese negotiators? Taiwanese particularly. Persistence and determination is a very, very valued as an indicator of success. If you're persistent, you're determined, you'll succeed in a negotiation. Win respect and confidence. Again, we have the face saving issue. Planning, preparation and planning skill, and product knowledge, highly sought after by Taiwanese negotiators. You can see some of these things overlap, but their level of importance is a little different for each. Brazilian negotiators, interestingly enough, pretty much agree with American negotiators. And so maybe there's something about Western culture, even among Brazilians, that seems to kind of run along the lines of Americans. I want you to listen to this. This is a Japanese, I'm going to read you something that a Japanese negotiator wrote to explain to other Japanese negotiators how to deal with American negotiators. I got this from an article by Michelle LeBaron. Michelle LeBaron is with the faculty of the University of British Columbia. She was with George Mason University before that. She is directing the University of British Columbia's dispute resolution program and is apparently fairly well known in this area. So she's quoting this. That's why I got it from her website called beyondintractability.org. And so, but I want to share this with you. These are not her words. These are the words of a Japanese negotiator. Here's what he said. American negotiators tend to be competitive in their approach to negotiations, including coming to the table with a fallback position, but beginning with an unrealistic offer. And it sounds like some of the things we've talked about. They tend to be energetic and confident and persistent. They enjoy arguing their positions. And they see things universally, i.e., they like to talk about broad applications of things. They tend to concentrate on one problem at a time. We just talked about that. They tend to focus on areas of disagreement, not areas of commonality or agreement. I'm going to come back to that for a second. And they like closure and certainty rather than open-endedness or fuzziness. Now, if you're an American, if that's your predominant culture, much of this should sound pretty familiar to you, particularly this idea of focusing on areas of disagreement. I think that's absolutely true. I've seen it so many times in my own practice over the years, and in observing negotiations among students, I have observed that that tends to be the focus. Americans tend to want to get to the problems of disagreement, so we like to solve things, right? We like to solve problems. So we don't talk about what we have in common because who cares? We've agreed on that. Let's move on, right? Nothing to talk about. We don't even think we have to talk about that. You know, if we agree the sky is blue, we move on. We don't continue discussing it. And but we have to be careful as Americans because other people may want to talk about the fact that we agree the sky is blue. They may want to chit-chat about that for a while. They may want to chew on it for a bit. And so if you're negotiating across cultures, you may want to keep that in mind and consider that as you're thinking about it. That you're going to just want to be sensitive. My recommendation would be, to the extent you are negotiating with people who are not of your culture, and do your research, figure out what you might be dealing with, and then out-polite them. Okay, out-polite them. And by that I mean you be more polite to them than they are to you. You overdo a little bit to show them that you're concerned about their concerns. Now, what about on the American front? So this is not cross-cultural, this is just a handful of observations about American negotiators. First, are there any differences between male and female negotiators? There's all kinds of literature out there, you can read all kinds of articles, all kinds of speculation. What I'm going to tell you is based only and singly on me watching literally hundreds of student negotiations. Okay, that's all I'm basing this on. These are Regent Law School students over over 6 years, I think, of teaching negotiations on campus. So 12 semesters worth. You're talking about literally several hundred negotiations during that time. This is my observation about the differences between men and women. If you have men negotiating together, they just do business. They tend to be very businesslike. It doesn't generally get very heated. It can, but generally not. That tends to be personality driven, not driven by their maleness. That is, in other words, you would think, oh, 4 guys, 2 guys on each side negotiating, the testosterone is going to go through the roof. That has not actually been my experience. Guys negotiating with guys, there tends to be for the most part, pretty much of a laid-back sort of attitude that, hey, we're going to get this done. Let's get it done. Let's work a deal out. Let's see what we can do. If the mix is guys and gals, again, for the most part, it seems to go along the lines of what I see when I see all males. Again, it just tends to be kind of what I would consider to be the ordinary run-of-the-mill. You might have one person who's super passionate. It's just because that's just the way they are. It has nothing to do with their maleness or femaleness. Interestingly enough, though, if in situations where typically I had people negotiate in teams, so I would have two people on each team. If I had a group of 2 females against 2 females, and again, this is a rule of thumb, it tended to be more aggressive, quite frankly. The ladies tended to be more aggressive with each other. If I had 2 females against 2 males, not so much on either side. So I don't know if that's a factor of the Regent student population at the law school during that time period. I don't know. Maybe it's just hard to say. What I can say is this. That was the only difference I observed. When you tended to have females with all female negotiating teams, there did tend to be a heightened aggressiveness among everyone, the whole group. Otherwise not. I don't know that means anything. The studies that have been done do seem to indicate that gender roles are more a matter of perception than reality. And you can read studies about whether women should wear short skirts and that kind of nonsense in a negotiation, and whether they're taken more seriously, whether blondes are taken more seriously. I mean, it's all out there. Trust me. I've looked at some of this stuff. I think that if you're a female, don't go in with the attitude that, well, some guy is going to treat me differently. Go in with the attitude you're going to be businesslike and just get the deal done, or work it out, or do whatever you're going to do. I mean, you go in with the attitude you're going to be businesslike. If you're a guy and you're negotiating with a woman, then you go in with the attitude you're going to be businesslike. And if you both come in with that attitude, then it really doesn't make any difference. Are there any race issues? Not that I'm aware of. I think that might matter if people let it matter, but there's no obvious issues there, no studies that I've been able to find that say there's any indication that Americans of any stripe negotiate any differently than other Americans. We're all, shockingly enough, despite our perceived differences, as Americans, we tend to pretty much negotiate very similarly, regardless of the color of our skin. So that doesn't seem to be an issue at all. Rural versus urban, is there any difference? Well, as someone who's lived in both rural and urban areas, I think probably the biggest difference among rural negotiators and urban negotiators probably relates to getting rolling. I expect that rural negotiators probably are more likely to engage in kind of a build-up to things and probably not dive right in as quickly. For the most part, again, it's a rule of thumb. It'll serve you to at least to have an expectation. If your expectation ends up being different, or if the reality ends up being different, that's fine. If you're an urban negotiator and you expect some rural guy to just jump right in and he doesn't, you're going to be bitterly disappointed. So don't expect him to, and if he does, great. So that otherwise, I don't know that there's a whole lot of difference there. I just think it'll move at a bit slower pace just because rural folks do tend to move at just a hair slower pace than other Americans in general. It's not true of everybody, obviously. All right, what about alternative dispute resolution, which is Gifford's chapter 12? Just read that chapter. I really don't have a whole lot to say about it. Arbitration and mediation are the two main dispute resolution mechanisms outside litigation, which is not an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. That is the not primary, but that is the fundamental dispute resolution mechanism we have in our country. You have negotiation, arbitration, mediation. We've talked all semester about negotiation. I won't say anything about that. Arbitration generally means that you are agreeing to have a third party decide for you what the outcome is going to be of the circumstance. Typically, it involves parties engaging with the arbitrator and engaging with each other to varying degrees. It can be basically a full-blown trial in front of an arbitrator, to a much more modest type negotiation or arbitration where parties simply maybe send in a letter setting forth their position on something. So it could run the gamut. You can have high-low arbitrations. What that means is that the parties set a parameter in which, and then tell the negotiator, make your decision. You don't tell the negotiator what the high and the low are. In other words, the parties agree that the bottom line outcome of the arbitration will be $10, the high will be $100, and then the parties simply tell the negotiator, here's the circumstance, give us a number, and the arbitrator then gives a number. It's amazing, and I had done a few of these when I was practicing in Virginia. Amazingly enough, the arbitrators often seem to have an uncanny ability to hit that middle mark on many occasions. I don't know how they did it. But that's a high-low arbitration. There are other kinds of arbitration. I'm not going to deal with them. I think Gifford does talk a little bit about those in the book. You can read about that. I don't have a lot more to say about it. Mediation is much more prevalent these days, non-binding mediation in particular. Non-binding mediation just means the parties basically get together under the auspices of a third party neutral who tries to get everybody together. And the third party neutral often these days is a retired judge. And some of them are good at it, some of them aren't. Some of them have a natural affinity for getting people together, and some don't. And I would just say that if you want your mediations to work, you should try to learn which judges are good at it and get them to do your mediations. But that's the general principle of mediation, is just that some third-party neutral listens to both sides and tries to point out to both sides the relative strengths and weaknesses of their positions. And it oftentimes is useful if you have a very intransigent client. There is such a thing, and I'm going to mention this and then I'm going to shut up. There is such a thing called non-binding arbitration. I don't get it. It just, I don't even know. As you can tell, I'm speechless because I just don't get. That's, to me, non-binding arbitration is a mediation. Might as well be a mediation. I'm not sure I get it. I think it's pointless. So I think that there's no. I don't know that anybody does those. Maybe they do. I've never seen it done, and I don't understand why anyone would agree to it. Quite frankly, it's an exercise in futility. As best I can tell. I'm sure there's some, and maybe somebody in the class, if you have an example of non-binding arbitration you're aware of, please send an email to everyone or send it to me and I'll forward it to everybody because I don't get it. All right, so that's it. That's everything. We are now done, and you'll have some exercises to do, and we will get pounding through negotiations after this, and you'll finish the course with several negotiations, and I look forward to seeing those.